I've always believed in fate, not the grand, cosmic kind, where stars align and souls dance through lifetimes. No, my faith in fate was simpler, smaller, a belief that life had a way of nudging people toward where they were supposed to be, subtle, quiet, inevitable. So when I met him, it felt like one of those nudges, a small, perfect accident. It was late autumn when we first crossed paths, the city already wrapped in the brittle chill of early winter. I had stopped for coffee at a small, dimly lit cafe, one of those hole-in-the-wall places that felt forgotten by time. I liked it there. The air always smelled like burnt sugar and old books, and the chairs wobbled just enough to feel personal. That day, I had been sitting by the fogged-up window, fingers curled around a ceramic cup, watching the world smear past in blurred silhouettes. And then he walked in. I noticed him in that peripheral way you notice strangers. No grand significance, just a passing imprint of someone existing near you. But something about him made me look twice. He had the kind of presence that made a room feel smaller, like he carried his own gravity. His dark coat was dusted with faint traces of rain, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. He wasn't particularly handsome, not in the way movies dictate, but he had something better. He had depth. He ordered coffee, black. No hesitation, no small talk with the barista, no phone in hand as a distraction. Just a quiet, deliberate stillness. And then, just as I was about to look away, he glanced in my direction. A single moment. Barely anything. But I felt it deep in my bones. Fate. Maybe that's why. When he sat near me, I found myself saying something. A small remark, a nothing comment about the rain, spoken into the space between us. I wasn't usually this bold. I was the kind of person who let moments slip by, always too afraid of disturbing them. But he smiled, just slightly, just enough, and replied. I remember thinking how warm his voice was, how steady. We talked about small things, about books and music, and the way the city smelled after it rained. He listened in a way most people didn't. Like he wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak. Like he was truly present. And then, just as I was reaching for my phone to capture the moment, to take a small, fleeting snapshot of this perfect accident, he shifted. Don't, he murmured. His tone was soft, almost apologetic. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. You don't like photos? Something flickered in his expression. Not quite fear, but something close. I just prefer not to be in them. A small, odd thing to say, but not unreasonable. Some people were private, guarded. Maybe he was self-conscious, or maybe he was just one of those people who believed in experiencing life without documenting it. I laughed it off, setting my phone aside, and the moment passed. We left the cafe together, the conversation stretching between us like a thread. It was easy, effortless. The kind of connection you don't question, because questioning it might make it disappear. He walked me home, his pace unhurried, as if he had nowhere else to be. And when we reached my apartment, he didn't ask to come inside. He just looked at me, his dark eyes catching the dim glow of the streetlights, and said, I'd like to see you again. That was all. No insistence, no hesitation. Just a quiet certainty, like he already knew the answer. And of course I said yes. I saw him again the next evening, and the evening after that. It wasn't planned, not really. We never set specific dates or times, yet he always seemed to be there. On the corner near my apartment, outside the cafe where we first met, walking along the quiet streets where the city's noise faded into a hum. It felt natural, effortless, a silent understanding between us. He never told me much about himself, and I never asked. There was something delicate about our moments together, like an unspoken agreement not to break the spell by demanding too much. Instead, we talked about things that felt weightless, music, old poetry, the places we wanted to visit but never had. It was enough, or at least I thought it was. The first time I noticed something was off, it was barely more than a flicker of doubt. We were walking along the river, the streetlights casting pools of amber light onto the pavement. It had rained earlier, and puddles dotted the walkway, reflecting the glow above. I turned to him, ready to say something about the way the water shimmered like gold. And then, nothing. His reflection wasn't there. For a moment, my breath hitched. My eyes darted back and forth between him and the water, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe the light had shifted. Maybe the angle was wrong. Maybe I blinked and suddenly it was there. His reflection, standing beside mine, slightly distorted by the ripples. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking off the strange, creeping feeling that had wrapped around my ribs. I was being ridiculous. Just a trick of the light. But once you start noticing something, it's hard to stop. A few days later, I tried to take another photo. Not to test him, not intentionally, just a casual moment, a picture of the street as we walked side by side. I held up my phone, framing the shot, pressing the shutter without thinking. Later that night, I looked at the picture. He wasn't there. The street was empty, the pavement wet with rain, the neon glow of a shop sign casting eerie blues and reds across the sidewalk. But where he had been standing, where I knew he had been standing, there was nothing. Just air. A slow, creeping dread settled in my chest. I stared at the image for what felt like hours, flipping between others I had taken that evening. Every single one was the same. Me, the city, the soft blur of passing cars. But never him. I didn't say anything. What could I say? That my new boyfriend, if I could even call him that, somehow didn't exist in photographs? That I was losing my mind? Instead, I told myself it was nothing. A glitch. A mistake. Until the mirrors. It happened late one night when he came over for the first time. We sat on my couch, the television playing some forgettable film in the background. He was close, his warmth seeping into me, his presence grounding in a way I couldn't quite explain. I turned to say something, to tell him how much I liked this, the quiet, the ease of it all, when my eyes flickered to the mirror across the room, and my blood ran cold. I was there, of course, sitting exactly as I was, my body angled toward him, my hair spilling over my shoulder. But beside me, where he should have been, nothing. The couch was empty. I froze, my mouth half open, my pulse roaring in my ears. I darted my gaze back to him. He was still there, still watching me, still real. But in the reflection, the absence of him was glaring, suffocating. My breath came out shaky. My hands curled into fists against my lap. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to scream. But more than anything, I wanted to understand. So I did nothing. I forced myself to smile, to act as if I hadn't noticed the gaping hole where he should have been. I turned my attention back to the television, nodding absently at whatever he was saying. But I didn't watch the movie. I watched the mirror. I watched as I laughed at something he said, my reflection alone, laughing at nothing. I watched as my body shifted closer to him, my image curling toward an empty space. I watched as I reached for his hand, and in the mirror, my fingers grasped at air. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more absurd than the last. Was he a trick of my imagination? A hallucination? Had I finally fractured under the weight of my own loneliness? Or was it something else? Something worse? By morning, I had convinced myself it didn't matter. So what if he didn't show up in mirrors or photographs? People had quirks, secrets. Maybe this was just his. Maybe love meant accepting the parts of someone you didn't understand. So I ignored it. Even when strangers on the street would look at me oddly as we passed, their expressions uncertain, almost pitying. Even when the cashier of the coffee shop hesitated before handing me my change, her gaze flickering over my shoulder before quickly looking away. Even when I caught glimpses of myself in shop windows, always alone, always walking just a little too close to something that wasn't there. I ignored it all, because he was real. He had to be, didn't he? I didn't bring it up. Not once. Maybe that was my first mistake, pretending I didn't notice, refusing to acknowledge the impossible. But what else could I do? There was no logical explanation, no way to confront it without sounding completely unhinged. And he was real. I could feel him, hear his breath when he spoke, watch the way his fingers absently traced patterns against his knee when he was lost in thought. He was solid, tangible, but reflections didn't lie. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it clawed at me. One night, I decided to test it again. We had spent the evening at my apartment, sitting close on the couch, my head resting lightly against his shoulder. He always smelled faintly of rain, even when the skies were clear. It was comforting in a way. At some point, he excused himself to use the bathroom. The moment he was out of sight, I reached for my phone. I held it up, aiming the front-facing camera at myself. I took the picture quickly, my pulse pounding. When I looked at the screen, my stomach turned to ice. I was alone. The room stretched behind me, exactly as it was. The couch, the dim glow of the television, the blanket draped over the armrest. But the space beside me, where he had been only moments before, empty. I stared at it, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. A second later, I heard the bathroom door open. I nearly dropped the phone in my rush to lock it and shove it away. He walked back into the room as if nothing was wrong, as if he had been there all along. I wanted to scream, to shove the phone in his hands and demand he explain why I could never capture him in photos, why the world refused to acknowledge his presence. But I didn't. I forced a smile. I curled back into his side, and I told myself that as long as I could feel him, as long as he was here, nothing else mattered. That lie didn't last long. It was the passers-by who started to break me. The way people's gazes slid past him, unseeing. The way their eyes would lock onto mine with expressions that flickered between concern and something else, something close to fear. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was becoming paranoid, reading too much into the glances of strangers. Until one evening, when we were walking together through a quiet street, and an older woman coming toward us suddenly stopped. I didn't notice at first. I was laughing at something he had just said, my arm loosely linked through his. But then I caught movement in my peripheral vision, her hand, trembling slightly, rising to her mouth. I slowed my steps. Her eyes were locked on me, wide and glassy with something unreadable. I swallowed, hesitating. Are you? She turned abruptly and crossed the street without another word. I stared after her, my heart hammering against my ribs. Beside me, he let out a quiet sigh. Ignore them, he murmured. People get caught up in their own worlds. They don't always understand what they're seeing. His words should have been reassuring. But they weren't, because they weren't seeing him at all. That night, I decided I had to know. He had left my apartment late, pressing a lingering kiss to my forehead before disappearing into the night. I waited exactly 30 minutes before I grabbed my coat and followed. I didn't know where he lived. He had never mentioned it, never invited me over. I had never even seen him go home. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe for him to turn a corner and vanish into the dark. Maybe to find him walking endlessly, circling the city like something untethered from time. But I didn't expect this. I trailed him from a safe distance, my steps light against the pavement. He walked with that same unhurried ease, hands tucked into his pockets, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. And then, abruptly, he stopped. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. We stood on a deserted street, the glow of a single street lamp stretching long shadows across the sidewalk. Slowly, he turned his head. He was looking directly at me. I felt my stomach plummet. He shouldn't have known I was there. I had been careful, quiet. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us felt suffocating. Then, finally, he smiled. Not the soft, warm smile I had come to know. This one was sad. Knowing. You shouldn't be here, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it felt deafening. I opened my mouth, but no words came. I was hoping you wouldn't do this, he continued, his tone gentle. That you wouldn't try to see past what you wanted to believe. Something inside me cracked. What are you? I asked, my voice raw. Why aren't you? But I couldn't finish the sentence. He took a step toward me, and my body locked up. Go home, he murmured. Please. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. And then, just as suddenly as he had stopped, he turned and kept walking. I watched him disappear around the corner, and then I ran. I didn't sleep that night. I sat curled on my bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror across the room. My own wide eyes stared back, hollow with exhaustion. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining this. I reached for my phone with shaking fingers, scrolling back through my gallery. There were no pictures of him, no evidence he had ever existed. And yet, I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against them. I could still feel the warmth of his hands. I could still hear the way he said my name. I wasn't imagining that. I swallowed against the rising nausea, forcing myself to breathe. I had to find the truth, even if I wasn't ready for it. I didn't see him for days after that night. Not because I avoided him, because he disappeared. No chance encounters at the cafe. No waiting for me outside my apartment. No quiet, unspoken understanding that he would always be there. He was just gone. At first, I told myself it was normal. People needed space. Maybe he was upset that I had followed him. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he was never real. That thought festered, dug its claws into me, refused to let go. I stopped leaving my apartment. I barely ate. I barely slept. I spent hours staring at my phone, scrolling through my messages, none from him, of course. There was no number saved under his name. I had never texted him, never called. How had I never noticed that before? One night, I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked in sweat, my head pounding. The dream had already begun to slip away, dissolving like ink in water, but the feeling remained. The weight of something pressing down on my chest. A whisper curling through my ears like smoke, distant but intimate. Wake up. The words sat in my skull, heavy, suffocating. Wake up from what? I stopped checking the mirror. It wasn't avoidance. Not exactly. It was just easier. Because every time I caught my own reflection, something felt wrong. At first, it was little things I could ignore. The tilt of my head seemed off. My eyes looked darker, hollowed out by exhaustion. My movements felt just slightly delayed, as if my reflection was struggling to keep up. Then it got worse. One morning, I forced myself to look, really look. I leaned in close, bracing my hands on the bathroom sink, my breath uneven. My reflection blinked a second too late. I felt it in my bones, a slow, creeping horror that settled deep in my gut. I lifted a hand. My reflection followed, but I saw it. That fraction of hesitation. That delay. Like it wasn't copying me. Like it was deciding to move. I lurched back, knocking over the toothbrush holder, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't check again after that. Days bled into each other. I lost track of time. The city outside my window felt distant, like a place I had never truly belonged to. I must have slept, but I don't remember dreaming. I only remember waking up with a lingering sensation that something had been watching me. It got worse when I left the apartment. People stared at me differently now. Before, it had been subtle. Quick glances, a flicker of unease in their expressions. Now, it was full-on discomfort. Some wouldn't even look at me. Others looked like they wanted to say something, but couldn't. Like their mouths wouldn't let them. One woman, an older lady walking past me on the sidewalk, stumbled and nearly fell when she saw me. She clutched at her chest, eyes wide with something close to panic. I tried to ask if she was okay, but before I could get the words out, she turned and ran. I found a photograph of myself, not a recent one. It was an old picture buried deep in a stack of forgotten things in my closet. I barely remembered taking it, but when I looked at it, really looked at it, something inside me turned cold. It was me, but it wasn't. The shape of my face was the same. The hair, the posture, the clothes, everything matched. But the eyes were different. There was something there that I couldn't explain. Something alive in the photo. Something that didn't feel like me. I flipped it over with shaking hands, hoping for a date. There was none, but there was writing. Faint, smudged, as if someone had written it in a hurry. Don't forget yourself. My vision blurred. I dropped the photograph. I didn't pick it up. I saw him again. Or maybe he saw me first. It was raining. One of those cold, stinging autumn storms that made the world feel raw and unwelcoming. I was walking without direction, my hood pulled up, my arms wrapped tightly around myself. And then I felt it. A presence. Not just someone nearby, but something watching. I turned sharply, and there he was, standing just across the street. Not moving, not blinking, just watching me. I didn't think. I ran to him, my breath catching in my throat, my fingers curling into fists. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to demand answers. But when I reached him, when I stood just inches away, I couldn't speak. Because something about him was wrong. He looked different, not physically. His face was the same. His posture, his clothes, his dark, rain-slicked hair. But he wasn't standing right. He was too still, like he was waiting for something, like he wasn't entirely there. Slowly, he reached out, His fingers brushed against mine, and suddenly the world tilted. The rain around us slowed. The city dimmed. And for one agonizing moment, everything felt wrong. Like I wasn't supposed to be here. Like I wasn't supposed to exist. His hand tightened around mine. His voice was barely a whisper. You have to remember, my vision swam. I tried to pull back, but my body wasn't listening. You have to wake up. The street around us flickered. I gasped, my chest tightening with something sharp and unbearable. And then, darkness. A cold, consuming nothingness. A silence so deep it felt like I had never spoken at all. And somewhere in the void of voice, not his, not mine, something older, something waiting. There you are. I woke up gasping. The darkness was gone, but the cold wasn't. It clung to my skin, soaked into my bones like something that had always been there. My breath came in ragged gulps, my lungs struggling to remember how to work. I was in my apartment, lying on my bed, my blankets tangled around me. The room was dim, the weak glow of a street lamp seeping in through the curtains. For a moment, I told myself it had been a dream, but then I turned my head and saw the photograph. It was sitting on my bedside table, the one I had dropped, the one I had refused to pick up, and now it was here. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Slowly, my fingers curled into the sheets. Something was very, very wrong, because the photograph had changed. The image was the same, me, standing in some forgotten moment in time. But the writing on the back, the faint, smudged message, it wasn't smudged anymore. It was clear. You have to remember, my stomach lurched. I shoved the blankets off and stood too quickly, my legs trembling beneath me. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I grabbed the photograph with shaking hands, turning it over again, hoping, praying that I had imagined it. But the words were still there. And below them, something new. A date. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to read it. 3 years ago. I frowned. That didn't make sense. I didn't remember taking this picture 3 years ago. I didn't even recognize the background. I searched my memory, trying to place it, but it was like staring into static, an empty, buzzing nothingness where the memory should be. I turned too quickly, catching my reflection in the mirror across the room. And for the first time, I really looked at it. The wrongness was undeniable now. I was pale, too pale. My eyes were too dark, too sunken. There was something off about my expression, something unfamiliar lurking beneath my skin, like I was watching myself from the outside. I stepped closer. My reflection didn't. I froze. A sick, curdling terror spread through my chest. I lifted a shaking hand. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't move. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. And then it smiled. A slow, unnatural stretch of lips. Too wide, too knowing. I choked on a scream. And then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark. Minutes. Hours. Time felt meaningless. I pressed myself against the farthest corner of the room, my knees drawn to my chest, my fingers clenched so tightly around the photograph that the edges dug into my skin. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it. I couldn't hear it. But I felt it. Something standing just out of reach. Something that had been there all along. I don't know how I knew, but I did. It wasn't him. It was never him. And suddenly, I remembered the words he had said to me before the darkness swallowed me whole. You have to wake up. Something clicked. Something that had been buried deep, deep inside me. I had been asleep. Not for a night. Not for a week. For years. I don't remember leaving my apartment. One moment, I was sitting in the dark, suffocating beneath the weight of something I couldn't name. And then I was outside. The cold air stung my skin. The city around me blurred and too distant, like I was walking through a world that didn't belong to me anymore. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop, because I knew where I had to go. Somehow, despite the fog clouding my thoughts, despite the way the streets twisted into unfamiliar shapes, my feet carried me forward, until I reached it, the place where I had last seen him. The empty street, bathed in the dim glow of a single, flickering street lamp. And there he was, waiting. I stumbled to a halt, my breath sharp and ragged. He looked the same, exactly the same, like he hadn't moved, like he had been standing there forever. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally, you remember now. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. What happened to me? His gaze softened. You already know. I shook my head. No, I don't. My voice broke. Because I did know. I had always known. I just didn't want to see. The memories hit like a tidal wave, slamming into me with a force that nearly sent me to my knees. The accident. The cold, sterile lights of a hospital room. The feeling of being trapped, weightless, lost in a limbo I couldn't escape. I hadn't just been asleep. I had been gone. And I had created him, fabricated his existence, shaped him into something real because I couldn't accept what had happened to me. My fingers dug into my arms, my nails biting into my skin. No, y whisperat. The street around us flickered. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out, gentle, steady. It's time, he murmured. I was shaking. I don't want to go. His expression was pained. I know. I closed my eyes, my body trembling. The streetlight above us flickered wildly, the shadows stretching, twisting. The city was unraveling. Because I wasn't supposed to be here. Because I had never been here. I sucked in a shuddering breath. And I took his hand. The world around me blurred. Faded. Darkness pressed in, deep and absolute. For a moment, I thought it would swallow me whole. And then, light. A sharp, blinding light. I gasped, my body lurching forward, air rushing into my lungs like I had been drowning. Voices. Distant. Familiar. Machines beeping. A hospital room. My fingers twitched. My throat felt raw. And then, a hand gripping mine. Tight. Warm. I turned my head. My mother. Her face streaked with tears. Oh my God, she choked out. You're awake.